Welcome to Insights in Sound, where we talk to the people behind the scenes, behind the technology, and behind the music. People you may not know, but you should.
My guest is composer Jeff Rona. How you doing?
Hey, good to be here, Daniel. Well, it's good to be here. I live here.
You live here. I'm glad you're here.
Yeah. Good to have you.
Thank you. It's good being had. Yeah. You do have a lot of film credits to your name, and I would like to start getting into a little bit of how you got into composing and everything. But there's also a parallel track that I find fascinating, which is the technical aspect of it.
Yeah.
You and I were both around during that era when the Earth was still cooling and MIDI was one of those things that was not a gleam in anybody's acronym yet.
A gleam in Herbie Hancock's eye.
Indeed, yes. So let's kind of start off with musical beginnings. Did you always aspire to be a composer, or were you a rock and roll guy first, or what?
Neither. I was studying to be a photographer.
Interesting.
Had a dark room, had cameras. That was kind of where my head was at for a long time. But along the way, I had some interesting experiences in sound and music that kind of ended up taking over.
Interesting. So you were always into the visual, and that probably served you well in terms of composing.
I guess, I also had a little video camera, a little film camera at first.
Right, of course.
And then a video camera, and did my own editing, even on splicing 16 millimeter film.
Ooh, fun.
Sort of. In retrospect, not while you're in the middle of it.
Well, about as much fun as splicing 2-inch tape. Maybe
that
more.
That part I love. I was really good at that, actually. Anyway, I guess I was just attracted to different ways of telling stories. And
I can understand that.
Was drawn to visual, both in moving and still pictures, and just, I don't know. I don't think it was an epiphany, but, in many ways, I feel like my career chose me, and not the other way around. And I think that's true of a lot of my life, in that a number of random things have happened to me that completely changed everything.
I call it allowing the path to illuminate as you walk on it.
Absolutely. Some people might call it serendipity.
Yeah.
It's
what the universe hands you.
I like yours better. I think the thing that drove me towards everything that I've ever done and will continue to do is having a somewhat insatiable curiosity. People say follow your passion. I say follow your curiosity. It's far more rewarding and fulfilling. It's not the carrot on a stick. It's, what's that? It looks like a carrot on a stick. Who put the carrot on the stick? So my brain is always trying to decode the whys and whats of the world. And, that's just led me to do things that had no purpose, no point.
But isn't it kind of, if you think about it, intertwined with the passion? Because if we're not driven, if we're not curious about something, it's because we're not driven by it.
Sure. There are definitely things I'm not hungry to know. I still get fascinated.
Absolutely.
I'm not like a trivia nerd or any of that, but...
I at one time I had I bought an old British sports car. And it was a basket case, and I towed it home, and I had my next door neighbor, who was a professional mechanic, help me to rebuild it. And it was like a 6-month project. To this day, I'm not passionate about knowing the ins and outs of an internal combustion engine, but the curiosity factor was enough to motivate me to learn enough to say, hey, Spence, how do I do this?
100%.
And that, I think, is what you're talking about. There's, we're not necessarily geniuses at everything we do, but we want to gain a functional understanding of all of these different facets, especially because in certain ways we touch them with what we are passionate about.
Yeah, I think so too. I
Yeah.
really do.
Which leads me to what we were just talking about before we rolled tape here, which is the idea that you kind of dabbled in all of these different things as you were allowing that path to light up. So from photography and video, did you have a musical background at all? Were you not passionate about music?
You know, no, I enjoyed it very much. You know, I'm a woodwind player. You know, I studied.
Clearly by your 87 flutes and recorders over there, yes.
86.
Oh, okay.
But I studied classically. I studied formally through elementary school and high school. By high school, I started having bands and experimenting with pop music. My parents had very conservative tastes. It was operas and Broadway show albums and piano music and just very, very straight stuff. And my older siblings listened to a little bit of rock and pop, but not a lot. And I didn't for a long time until about high school, and then started getting interested in these things and put together a little rock band, which is, you know, for a flute player to do is a little bit of hubris if you're not Ian Anderson. But, you know, by the time I got to college, I was an art major, but music just kept rearing its head. And I started writing a little bit, you know, even in high school, I started writing music a bit. And only because there are no flute parts in the jazz, in a big band, really, you know, so I
Unless
started
you're
off
playing
just,
Take 5, yeah.
you know, just transcribing things and then transposing things. And anyway, it was a healthy thing for me to do, so that eventually I started writing music just for myself, and it wasn't very good, for sure. But opportunities started presenting themselves. I had a roommate who had a passion for film scores and had a pretty big collection of them, and he turned me on to film music, and that was a big deal. That was definitely wait a minute. I mean, people write music for films. That's a thing.
It's interesting how you sort of discovered the film music world, because I think, as we will both acknowledge, film music is something that is, in certain ways, if you're not conscious of it, almost transparent.
That's the goal.
Yeah, exactly.
Some people would tell you that's the goal. Some would not. But, you know, music, there's a pathway with music that it passes. Things that come into our eyes, we tend to process intellectually, even paintings. Music passes kind of from the ear to the heart,
Yes.
and bypasses the conscious brain almost completely. It's incomprehensible both to music makers and music lovers. It will always be a mystery why we are so attracted to, and in fact need, these organized sounds to be fulfilled. It's the only art form that is universal on the planet. There are cultures that don't have written language. There are cultures that don't have choreography or more formal visual arts. But there really isn't a culture that I'm aware of that does not have
Absolutely.
music at the heart of their rituals, their traditions, the way they raise their children, the way they pass on stories. So, you know, from Zimbabwe to, you know, Ireland, it is the one thing that all human beings seem to share. You know, it's how mothers, you know, soothe their newborns, and
It's rituals in every culture. Absolutely, yeah. I want to back up a little bit and talk about this, because you kind of skipped over an important era there. And we're talking about the era where you went from figuring out how to do things like write scores and play classical and stuff like that, to the point where you all of a sudden discovered electronics and synths. Now, that didn't happen overnight in the real world, and it no doubt didn't happen overnight with you. So tell me a little bit about that genesis of going to electronic sounds, electronic instruments, and the challenges that presented, as well as the opportunities, obviously.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. So the first time I ever touched an electronic instrument was as I was finishing high school, and my school got, Moog used to make an educational synthesizer that was in a briefcase.
Ah, yeah, yeah, yeah,
I
of
don't
course.
remember what it was called, but it was just a little two oscillator, sub mini Moog thing that came in a little briefcase, and I got to play with that, and I was utterly fascinated. Prior to that, I used to take things apart and play around with radios and amplifiers and
This does not surprise me.
and feedback and turntables and spinning records backwards. So it wasn't like I wasn't kind of interested in fucking sound up in different ways, or just trying to get electronic things to do weird things. So I did a lot of that. Then I found that synthesizer and kind of got my very first taste of sort of formal analog synthesis. Then I went off to college at a little Cal State school here in California. And my first or second year there, a professor in the music department got a grant to purchase serial number 1 of an experimental digital music synthesizer. First one on the West Coast outside of a research lab at like Stanford. And it arrived, and it came from Dartmouth College. And it was just called the Dartmouth Project. And it was a non-real-time instrument. That is, you typed in a language, and you built instruments, you built timbres, and then you created performances. But it was all done through writing code.
Sounds pretty convoluted.
It wasn't pleasant, but I was absolutely mesmerized. And the school went into vacation just as I got it working, and it meant 3 weeks where I couldn't get my hands on it. So I stole the key, which is government property, slept on the floor, but learned that thing, and learned the language, and read the manuals, and figured out how to work it, and wrote a bunch of music. My school also had a little analog music lab with tape machines and a pair of Putney VCS3s from EMS. And so that there were those, and I did some hybrid things where I combined analog and digital. But I'm literally one of the very first people to have their hands on a digital synthesizer on the West Coast. That was a lot to me, and it got me started in the learning of code. Then I was at a concert at a little shoebox 50-seat theater in Hollywood, and I overhear a guy behind me talking about teaching a computer to improvise music, a desktop computer. And this is pre-Mac, this is pre-Apple. And I'm in this lab coding, pieces of music. And I turn around and I introduce myself. I said, I want to hear more because that's what I want to do this. And that started a relationship with, he was a rocket scientist. He worked for Jet Propulsion Laboratories, and his hobby was creating musical software.
What was his name?
Ray Juergens.
Okay, I don't know the name.
And Ray and I spent many years, and he taught me how to code properly, how to write assembly code. And that was an enjoyable experience. I mean, I never got great at it, but I got passable at it. And that led me to I ran into a Roland salesman at Guitar Center here in Hollywood, and the guy who was setting up some keyboards, and so some brand new keyboards nobody had ever seen were just going up on a shelf. And I said, oh, I can make a computer improvise and play your synthesizer, because this thing had voltages. It just had voltages and gates. And he just stares at me. He said, you have to meet my boss. So literally the next day, I'm at Roland's US offices, and the head of Roland, the president, who at the time was Tom Beckman,
Okay.
who now makes wine, owns a beautiful winery up in Los Olivos. He said, tell me more, and I told him more, but I kind of overstated how good I was at programming. And he said, well, we could use you here. We have some things coming up. And what they had coming up was actually the development of an instrument called the CompuMusic, which was a crappy box that Roland put out that plugged into an Apple computer, or it had different cards for different computers, and it had just the worst software. It was basically a step sequencer. Mm-hmm. It was basically a software version of their MC700, which was, if anybody ever actually learned how to use that, other than Steve Porcaro, God bless him. So I spent several months working on educational software ideas, projects for musicians to be able to control any synthesizer that had voltage control, which is at the time everything. You know, it introduced.
And that's all they had, basically, right? There was no MIDI at that point.
Well, you know, Oberheim had a digital connectivity that could.
Mini Moogs and all of those other instruments had control voltage I/O and stuff like that.
But Oberheim had a digital port.
Okay.
And I think Yamaha had something along those lines. And Roland.
But this was pre the MIDI spec,
this
right?
This is all before MIDI.
Okay.
So Roland had a digital cable that could connect a Jupiter 8, say, to a whatever, Juno.
I see.
And Oberheim had a digital cable that could connect one Oberheim thing to another, but it was only within
their worlds, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So a few months, less than a year into my time at Roland, two gentlemen from Roland Japan came to my office with two very large boxes, and they unloaded two electric pianos, two little digital pianos. And they said, we want to show you something. And on the back was this 5-pin connector. And they said, we want you to stop everything else you're doing and focus on this. We think this might be valuable. And these are the first two MIDI devices in the United States.
And these were both Roland devices?
These are two, these are just two cheap little digital pianos.
Sure.
That they put a prototype connector on. Anyway, that led me to focusing all my energy on what didn't even have a name yet. Mm-hmm. And so on behalf of Roland, I attended a meeting, a private meeting. It was me and Jim Mothersbaugh from Roland, Mark's younger brother, who actually ran the service department at Roland. He had left Devo and just focused on repairing synths. That was his style. But I attended this meeting with Tom Oberheim, Bob Moog, Carl Hirano, Roger Lin, a number of other Japanese engineers from Akai, Casio, Dave Smith, of course. Trying to think if anybody else from the U.S. was there. Anyway, all the brands. Mm-hmm. All the brands were in this room, probably about a dozen people. And this was discussing the fact that MIDI had come, the development of this protocol had come a long way, but wasn't ready for prime time. And Tom said, look, my company needs my undivided attention right now. I can't really drive this bus. We need somebody who knows, who has the time. I was a relatively new employee at Roland. I did not have anything much to do. So I raised my hand. I said, I'll do it. And Tom said, great. Who the fuck are you? I had never met any of these people. None of them had ever met me.
Rule number one, make yourself indispensable.
Well, this was a situation where all the other volunteers stepped one step backwards.
Exactly right, yes. I know this well.
No, I was enthusiastic. I was in my early 20s, and the idea of helping make this happen. And that's what I did for 7 years formally, another few years informally.
I mean, you're on the cusp of history.
Jim Cooper, too.
Of course. But you're on the cusp of history, and you realize that what you can contribute here is something that will be for the greater good.
Yeah, because there's far more than just technology at stake here. There is getting the entire world of competitors to become collaborators.
Yes.
There was the fact that some people had more to say than others, and that some people's voices were more important. But so there was a level of diplomacy. There was a level of organization. There was nothing. There was no MMA. There was no MIDI Manufacturers Association. There was nothing. It was just these 10 guys from Japan and the U.S.
Some small companies and some very large companies, and
I mean, mostly fairly substantial companies at the time. So I worked my ass off to figure out how to build a communication system, a verification system, a system of checks and balances, a way of not stepping on any toes, a way of fostering innovation. Chris Meyer was there. And Chris, I think, is one of the most important people in this whole equation. He became the chairman of the technical committee for Roland for the MIDI Manufacturers Association, but I founded the organization. I paid a few $100s out of my pocket, hired a lawyer. We got a nonprofit status, so we didn't have to pay taxes, and we could still collect dues. And I clipped out of magazines addresses out of, old copies of Polyphony and Keyboard and anything I could find. And I wrote letters because I organized the first formal meeting, which actually was the 1 year that the NAMM show was in New Orleans. It was a terrible idea. Nobody wrote any business because everybody was out drinking, and et cetera. And this one time, I rented a little conference room, sent out all these letters, and I thought, if 20 people come, this is a hit. 100 people show up, and Carl Rona, who's the head of the MIDI Standards Committee in Japan, sort of formally anointed us and said, we will only talk to you. This is going to be a cooperation between us and you, and thus was born the MMA. And then there was just the hard work of, I translated all the Japanese documents into English, so I wrote the first English version of the MIDI spec. It was a lot of work, didn't always go well, but it introduced me to a fascinating world. I felt I made a good contribution.
I'd say so.
And I think I was able to get the best from the best and get it into the world in a way that, I'll be honest, I don't think there's ever been a technical standard before or since that became as ubiquitous and successful as effortlessly and as quickly as MIDI. I mean, you could look at almost anything from automobile standards to video standards, all the SMPTE standards, all the EBU standards, all the AES standards, took a decade.
Not to mention, going beyond its original intent of just being a musical instrument interface and becoming something that could be used for time code, for lighting, for all these other applications.
That all happened shockingly fast.
I agree. It did.
And it all happened because companies like lighting companies and audio companies would say, hey, why can't we? And we go, but we can. And, here's the lighting protocol, and here's General MIDI, and here's... General MIDI came a little bit later.
Yeah.
I think the developers of MIDI, well, I know so, really viewed this as something that high-end professionals were going to get a lot of use out of. That this was a great technology for on stage. I mean, after all, the whole reason the protocol was done the way it was as a serial protocol instead of a parallel protocol is parallel data, which is much faster, and that's what Oberheim was using, and Oberheim was kind of furious that MIDI wasn't following his lead, that he was sending data 8 times faster. But those ribbon cables, or all serial cables, all parallel cables, are prone to electromagnetic interference, such as those found on stages that have lighting faders.
Yes,
and
of course.
Power amplifiers.
Yes, of course.
Could potentially corrupt a MIDI message, and thus you'd get a stuck note. So the idea was that this was for Herbie Hancock and this, and Rick Wakeman and Keith Emerson and a few others.
But it was also for sequencer manufacturers, if you think about it, because it opened the door to MIDI sequencing, which again changed the game creatively.
Well, sequencers had already been around.
Right, but not.
Oberheim had one,
Yes.
Yamaha had one, Roland had one.
But again, as you said, they were all in their individual worlds, and they were not ubiquitous and universal. And I think that's
Right.
so. I want to bring it around full circle here, because you came to this originally from an artistic perspective. You were doing music. You fell into this as a technical standard, and yet it really did influence. It's like the left brain took over for a while, and then all of the stuff that you were doing with that left brain concept really completely influenced the way you and other composers worked from the creative side.
Well, look, the brain trust behind this technology is vast and formidable.
Sure.
And there were certainly disagreements. You and I talked about this once, that Bob Moog was not an early, he was not a fan, and in fact he wasn't a detractor, but he was a skeptic, and actually I think that was very healthy. He was a skeptic both in regards to the technology, but he was also wary of how loosely we were going about our business. We were a self-run organization. We were just a band of merry ladies and gentlemen, and Graham being an original part of this. She developed quite a lot of stuff for Oberheim, and Bob had this fear that it was somebody was going to sue somebody, and somebody was going to copyright something or register something,
Sure.
and we'd be SOL. Never happened. We did have one contentious conversation with the U.S. government, and how there were no standards. We didn't have a lock on the name. We didn't have a lock on a logo, and there was a logo. And we just said, we're just going to do this. The CD, the compact disc, was invented 10 years before the sale of the first compact disc. And that same idea is true everywhere. And it's not for commercial reasons. It's because of the government. And the governments need to vet every consumer product.
Makes sense.
From a technical perspective. Actually, it does make sense. And in any other case, that would have been fine. We weren't exactly a consumer electronics thing, We were a plug in the back of an expensive synthesizer and sequencer and drum machine, and later on other things.
Atari computer.
And then eventually, I was a liaison for Apple, so in the early days. They were like, wait a minute, you guys don't have any oversight? How are we really going to get involved with you? And I said, that's up to you. They had just, they were still working on the Macintosh when I met them for the first time. But I went up to Cupertino a couple of times, and I think I was persuasive that Apple should get involved, and they did. Apple II and Mac. And of course, there's MIDI in every Apple device. There's a full MIDI driver in every iPhone, every Android phone.
Now.
So there are literally billions of MIDI devices on the planet now.
But back then, I think the only computers that had a MIDI built in were the Atari.
The Atari ST is the only, and then the Amiga.
Oh, yes, that's right. I forgot about the Amiga.
In terms of a company committing real estate, actual physical space on a unit for music, not a good idea, personally. I don't think that was of much value. That's actually how I met Malcolm Cecil. He had taken a hiatus from music. So Malcolm was the producer who built Tonto, the original New Timbre Orchestra, and produced Stevie Wonder's albums. And is just a brilliant musician and technology guy. And he had taken a hiatus from music, was working for a little a computer startup building a computer, and it did not have any musical capabilities. And he talked his boss into adding music, and he knew that I knew. He knew that there was a guy at Roland who knew how to do that. So he reached out to me, and we became very close friends. I talked to him late last year. No, I talked to him during pandemic. So I talked to him late last year, and he was teaching jazz at a community college in upstate New York.
Wow.
He had given Tonto, he'd bequeathed Tonto to the Synthesizer Museum in Alberta, Canada.
Yes, I recall that, in fact.
But I remember Tonto, 'cause Malcolm lived in Topanga Canyon here in Los Angeles. And
Sure, I
Tonto
worked
was
with
up
Bob
at his
Margolis.
place.
And, yeah. Mhm.
So I used to go up and play with Tonto, and until it rained and got flooded, and because Tonto's made out of wood, it was a problem. Mark Mothersbaugh refurbished it
Uh-huh.
because he had something that Malcolm didn't have, which is money. So, you know, just MIDI in general, it took off like wildfire. Suddenly it became everything to everybody. And honestly, I can think of only one instrument in my knowledge that made a mistake and implemented MIDI incorrectly. There was one instrument that Casio made that had some issues. But, you know, the fact that people started developing MIDI interfaces for the Macintosh and Windows computers and everything, you know, just continued to fuel this fire. And then, of course, once there were interfaces, there was software, and suddenly, you know, there was Performer and MIDI
Cubase and
Cubase
yeah.
and music notation software, and then, of course, you know, the extensions of MIDI into mixing, automation. There were no plugins yet, but eventually all of that got worked out. Lighting,
Controllers.
and then synchronization became a big deal.
Yeah.
At first, synchronizing physical video and audio machines, which was quite a trick, and then eventually being able to synchronize virtual, you know, multiple computers, multiple, you know, a sequencer with a, you know, a drum machine with a computer with, I mean, you know, I don't think that a lot of sacrifices were made for the sake of simplicity, but simplicity and low cost. I mean, basically the philosophy was if it cost more than 50 cents in hardware, it was not viable.
Right, right.
And MIDI functions off of this one little chip, an off-the-shelf little clock chip. And the clock rate of MIDI was exactly the clock rate of this one chip. And the chip cost a few cents. So boom, done.
Now let's bring your career into this full circle, because were you already working as a composer when you started playing around with all this?
No, because I started at Roland. I mean, you know, I had dropped out of college. I'd worked for a music publishing company as an arranger and a proofreader and a sheet music editor. Had some odd jobs. I accompanied dance classes. So I was writing for myself. I was doing some avant-garde music for myself. I was working with choreographers.
Lots of money in that, yeah.
Well, who needs money?
Yeah,
you know, so I was writing for dance companies a lot. I had a big connection in the LA dance community and some fine arts things, doing gallery installations. Never put any of my music into the world, just performances. And then I did Roland for 4 years. I left 1 month shy of my 4th anniversary. And I left there, and actually ended up working for a little tiny company that was contracted by Yamaha to do software, MIDI software for them. Digital Music Services, run by a guy named Kevin Laubach, if you ever came across him. So I was doing that, but really where I was going was I started programming. And like I said, I started off as a synthesizer, not programming code. I was done with that.
Creating
Programming
sounds.
synths, I was one of the first guys who really knew how to sample here in LA. Now samplers were getting less expensive, emulators and Roland S50s.
Roland's S50, yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, are you the person I can blame that on?
Well, actually, on the Roland S50, on the keyboard version, there's a key that if you hold down one key and then turn the power on, it says, "Thank you, Jeff and Eric." And that's me and Eric Persing.
Yes, I
But no,
had
you
one
can't
of the,
blame me.
I had one of the first S50s actually.
But the samples, I did a lot of the samples.
And then they had the sequencer that went with it. You know, if you plugged in a monitor, you could use
Oh, yeah,
their
yeah.
little rudimentary
Well, you could
8-track
you could
sequencer.
you
Yeah.
could actually edit samples on a screen.
Yeah.
You know, a la Fairlight, but for a couple $100,000 less.
Yeah.
So I was programming synths, getting a lot of work in studios, working primarily on records, R&B, pop, rock records, working with these producers that I mentioned. But slowly, these film and TV composers were calling me, and in many cases, they were somewhat older composers who saw that film and TV was going a lot more electronic, and they were more legit. They were paper and pencil guys, and it's like, well, how am I supposed to compete and stay relevant? So the answer was hire that kid. So I started working on a lot of films and TV shows with a lot of composers.
And did you also help them on the technical side? I mean, setting up a MIDI
Not
room
really.
or anything like that?
No.
Because I don't know when that started to become a sort of a thing, you know?
I wasn't interested. That wasn't my job. I wasn't an assistant. I was a synthesist. Worked alongside Eric Persing and Michael Boddicker and
But a lot,
other guys.
yeah. But a lot of those old school guys that you're talking about, the pen and paper guy, or the pencil and paper guys, actually, they were creating scores that they would then take into an orchestra. And at one point, you know, there was this. I remember there was this massive transition, I guess, sometime in the '80s, where a lot of these guys, they either went to synthesizers or they retired.
Absolutely. And you know, they would buy something, not know how to use it, and that's where I came in.
Sure.
After doing that for a number of years, for composers here, and then I worked with Philip Glass in New York for a while, for a year or so, off and on, flying back and forth on projects. You know, they started offering me, hey, Jeff, I'm kind of getting behind. Could you write that scene? Could you score that scene? Could you score that scene? Kind of make it sound like me. So I became a ghostwriter. And around that time, I had the good fortune of actually a former Roland salesman who is now selling for some other company, call me up and say, hey, I just met this composer, just moved to LA. I think you and he would hit it off. His name is Hans Zimmer. I think you guys should meet. Let me set it up. And I met Hans a day or two later, and we hit it off, and I spent the next 8-10 years working with him. Moved my studio into his building, and we had there was a group of about 6 of us, plus a full recording studio and a staff.
Same place he's at now?
Same place.
Well,
when I first met him, he had a little room near Century City, in just a different location. But only for about a year. He was there maybe a year and a half. And then I met Mark Isham. He gave me my first television series, and Hans gave me my first film and another television series. And by give me, I mean recommended me.
Sure.
And I had to prove myself.
Of course.
And then I continued to. I have continued to collaborate. I worked with Hans on probably a dozen or more movies. Worked with Mark Isham on a handful of films and TV. Started working with Cliff Martinez. He was very good with synthesizers. But we worked on a number of films and video games and commercials together, and a bunch of other people. And because I had a background in music, I know how to write for orchestra.
And that was going to be the next thing I asked you was, do you ever go back to old school?
I write for orchestra all the time.
Do you?
This score is going to be recorded by an orchestra next month.
Yeah, it's interesting the way you've merged these two disciplines much more seamlessly than a lot of people have, I think.
I don't know. I find that working with synthesizers and working with an orchestra are surprisingly similar.
I could see that.
For one thing, when you write for an orchestra and when you orchestrate, your goal is to spread your ideas out fairly evenly across the spectrum of low to high.
Okay.
So that it doesn't get too high and shrill, doesn't get too boomy and muddy.
Unless you want that for an effect.
Unless you want that for effect. But generally speaking, effective symphonic writing, orchestral writing, uses the whole ear.
Uh-huh.
I find electronics to be exactly the same. When you are writing an electronic composition, obviously you have lead, you have pad, you have rhythm, you have bass, you have percussion. And again, you don't want to put too many instruments in the same octave because they start to cancel each other out because physics.
Sure.
Same with an orchestra. The same rules of timbre and satisfying writing are fairly similar. Obviously, where they vary is with an orchestra, you're given the instruments to write for, and then you write in your style. In electronic
Based on the
music,
characteristic of those instruments.
based on the
Right.
characteristic of those instruments, you would write something very different for an orchestra than you would for a piano solo,
Sure,
and for a
sure.
string quartet wouldn't be the same.
Right. You know if you want oboes or you want things like that.
Yeah.
You know, yes, of
You know,
course.
so you have the colors are kind of fixed, and then you can do interesting, and in fact can still continue to do new things that have not been done before, but with the instruments that are given to you. In electronics, first you have to design the orchestra, then you have to learn how to play those instruments, then you hopefully allow those instruments to inspire you to write for those instruments in a way that is completely appropriate for that instrument. And if you can do that, then you're a good electronic composer. So obviously, electronic music has aspects of timbre and ambience, and has an abstract quality that's very different, not absent from orchestral writing, but is very different. And to me, it's it's a peanut butter and jelly situation. One doesn't replace the other.
Sure.
I can
Different
either,
tools for a different job,
Yeah.
essentially. Yeah. Mhm.
and this comes down to just the very nature of storytelling.
Now that's a nice segue, because the other thing that I think is required for film scoring is an understanding of the psychology of music.
100%.
And-
It's what the job is. Literally.
Yes, exactly. And that is what I think really fascinates me, and is probably one of the more challenging things, because in that sense, I don't want to see you either have it or you don't, but to a certain extent, you either intrinsically understand what effect music has on the human psyche, or you don't.
Yeah, it's very true.
And an understanding of that, I think, has to be entirely necessary in order to take up the discipline of film scoring, because it's not like writing a pop tune. There's not a structure, there's not a format, it's not, verse, chorus, and you're out or anything like that. It's really very much a non-tangible entity. And as you said earlier, to a certain extent, sometimes the goal is to be invisible. And yet, without it, I have this conversation with people all the time, because I'm a bass player, and I talk about the idea that if I'm really doing my job, people are not going to notice unless I stop playing. Or I hit a wrong note, of course, but I think there's that aspect to a film score as well, where to a certain extent you almost don't notice it because it becomes part of the impact on the psyche that the entire package, the visuals and everything else, the story, all of that is having upon the viewer. And that experience is really so ubiquitous in a way.
Yeah, I agree completely. There's a level of it that's unfathomable, but every composer who puts music to picture finds out that there's no such thing as sheer neutrality. Music will always elicit an emotional response, even if it's just playing a middle C and that's it.
Yep.
By the way, I had no idea that was actually going to work.
That was very good.
Music always elicits a response, and those composers who I think are the most artistically successful are the ones who fathom the relationship of music and emotion.
Yeah.
Because film music, unlike concert music, which a lot of people sort of conflate, could not be more different, because writing film music is the most anti-intellectual thing there is you could do as a musician. It is all about eliciting emotions.
Yeah, it's all intuitive.
But that doesn't mean you mustn't be savvy. In fact, I don't think you can effectively elicit the complexity of emotions found in most storytelling without some style and technique.
Oh, I think if anything,
And I don't mean by technique, I don't mean training. There's plenty of film composers who can't read or write.
No, but I think you have to have an intrinsic understanding of how that works in order to get to the point of being, it's the same thing like learning an instrument. You have to be very, very focused on hand to muscle coordination in order to learn your instrument.
Right.
But the goal is to learn it to the point where you're not even thinking.
Right.
And it's the same kind of thing.
I would take that a step further, because with the exception of certain rock guitar players, and only a few, a performer, an instrumental performer who really wants to elicit an emotional response in the audience needs a fair amount of technique. If you handed me a classical guitar and said, make those people swoon, I mean, I could probably make them cry, but only if the doors were locked. And
I was peeling an onion.
No onion necessary.
Okay.
No, there is a relationship between technique and knowing one's tools.
Oh, no question.
To elicit, because sound elicits an emotional response, tonality elicits an emotional response, atonality elicits a response, rhythm, tempo. Every aspect of music has a direct connection. Sometimes I'll write a piece and the director will say, well, it's just not exciting enough. Well, let's take it up 3 BPM. Wow, this is working so much better now.
Sure.
Or they'll say this is too, this is, you're telling the audience too much. And I'll take out one melody and suddenly it's like, that's it.
Mm-hmm.
So tiny little tweaks can be astonishingly varied in how effective they are. So, yeah, the whole idea of musical storytelling, scoring, is to complete the vision of the storyteller in a language that storyteller likely does not speak, but will have a strong, strong reaction to, because we all grow up with music. And every director and producer and game developer I've worked with has music they like, music they don't like, and we don't start from scratch. We don't try to invent music in order to score a project. I want to know. I love knowing. What do you listen to at home? What do you picture? What kind of music do you picture in this scene where we find out that she's been lying the whole time? Is it sad? Is it angry? What kind of music makes you feel that way? And that's a beginning. And if they say I don't know, I'll say, well, I'll give you 2 or 3 options and let's see which one you go with.
But what's interesting about that to me is that, as you say, there's a lot of different options there. You could take the same scene and you could completely impact that scene by choosing one particular melody over another, one particular set of instruments or tonalities or whatever over another, whether you throw a timpani in there versus, a bongo or, whatever it is. I mean, there's all of these different aspects of that, and they're all on their own infinitesimal. But the overall impact that something has psychologically, I think that's invaluable. And I think being able to intuit that, to a certain extent, you're right. You have to understand technique. You have to, the same way that, for example, when I was producing records, I had a guitar player say to me one time, can you make my guitar sound a little more brown? Okay, I gave him brown.
Fabulous.
And it was just a matter of intuiting that, okay, he wants something a little warmer, he wants to, but that's the whole point there is you have to be able to make that leap from left brain to right brain and back again to say, okay, I understand what this needs, whether it's a scene or a musician asking for something. I understand what it needs. Here are my options how I can do that. here's technically how I can make that happen, and bring it back around again to the right brain and say, okay, now
Yeah.
I've made that happen. That is really very much the creative process in action.
Yeah, and every composer I know finds that trying to approach it with intent rarely works. Sometimes you really have to have happy accidents, and you have to be willing to experiment and play around with the structure and emotion of a scene
I'll bet.
before you get it right. You can come in going, I know exactly what to do here. And, yeah, sure, sometimes you're right. But quite often, if you come at it with too preset a sensibility, you're going to leave the best stuff on the table. And, the way you're describing music, I mean, take it into why we enjoy visual storytelling. I mean, why is film and TV, and to some extent video games, why are they the center of culture? More than books, more than sports, more than opera, more than everything. Film and TV and games. And when you think about what makes a good movie tick, whether it's science fiction or monsters or a love story or a comedy or a drama or a murder mystery, whatever it is, you have a set of characters who we have opinions about. Every movie begins by introducing the cast in one way or another, and you're going to like some and hate some, but you're going to latch on to one.
Mm-hmm.
Every movie needs, with very few exceptions, but generally speaking, you latch on to one, and then that person is your surrogate. Then you start putting obstacles in that person's way. And then we see if they solve it the way we would. And now we're invested. People who watch movies and TVs get invested in those stories and in those characters. And if you think about a scene in the middle of a show, movie, TV, where we find out that she's been lying the whole time. Cognitively, where the brain is going is they think you're going backward in time. Oh yeah, well, she did this and he did that and she said this and he questioned it and asked weird questions and maybe he knew she was going to do this. So it's not like this existential thing of I'm only paying attention to the scene I'm watching. Everything,
It's the story.
A story is a progression of scenes and situations through dialogue and action, each one leading to the next, leading to the next, leading to the next. So at any given time, I'm thinking about what's happened, and I'm anticipating what's going to happen next. Mm-hmm. Is she going to pull out a gun and shoot him? Is she going to confess the truth? Is she going to continue to lie? How's that going to affect his life? Is it a life and death situation? Is it funny? Is it sad? Mm-hmm. So our brains are just designed to absorb stories. The challenge as a musician isn't always just, well, what are the right notes and what are the right sounds? It's also the counterpoint and interweave of a story being told in real time, film, TV, where the pace is set, and how the music impacts that. So, for example, we find out she's been lying. If I change the music just before that, it will have a completely different effect as if I wait 3 seconds and shift the music after she makes the confession or he makes the, mm-hmm. the accusation or whatever. And that's because music just informs us in a way that actually looks forward more than it looks back. Uh-huh. When a new phrase comes in, we start,
queue up and get ready for something.
Our brain starts to think, 4-5-1 or, in a subtle, not technical way.
Yeah.
So no, it's very impressive.
Mm-hmm.
It's impressive to me how intuitive, how psychological, how literary this is. The writing of music for stories is literary structure. There is no 4-bar, 8-bar, 16-bar, anything
right.
in the lion's share of scores. sometimes that you do, and there are scores that are relatively. I mean, Daft Punk can write a score.
Sure. Chase scenes or whatever.
But even those,
yeah.
but those
Yeah.
those scenes actually have all kinds of meter and tempo changes because the more you link the music to the visual, the more the music becomes part of the story.
Sure.
There's a completely different sort of school of thought where you avoid synchronizing the music to the story too much because it used to be called cartooning because the old cartoons where every time you drop the coconut
Bonk. Yes,
the marimba blah.
Yep.
So cartooning is not the preferred way to do it. But so there's this interesting balancing act of music that cuts on picture and that doesn't, and that transitions in odd points, in the middle of a sentence, before somebody says something. So it's both functioning in sound and time, and that's visual storytelling. It is a temporal art. It's something that only works in time, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, it's the challenge and it's the joy of manipulating an audience's emotions as subversively as anything there is that you could ever do.
So you kind of almost fell into it as a course of what you were doing.
Yeah.
What would you say to somebody who wants to get into it, who's a young student or whatever at this point? I mean, the game is completely different now, obviously. On the one hand, it's probably harder to get into. On the other hand, it might be easier because there's a lot more media being created and everything. So, teenage or younger student who is studying and says, I really want to get into something like that. That's a hard field to get into. What would you tell them to do?
It is a hard field to get into. So, number one, listen to music all the time and not just scores. Listen to old music, new music, weird music, traditional music.
Gain a musical vocabulary, basically.
Understand what's been written and ask yourself how it makes you feel, and then try to ask yourself why. Is it the solo French horn playing a plaintive high melody over some cellos, or is it something, or no, it's just the fact that it's all in minor and some weird diminished chords. So really steep yourself in music, and definitely steep yourself in scores. Number one. Number two, get your brain wrapped around technology. There's no longer any excuse to deliver music that doesn't sound astonishingly good. And that means that you're not just a composer in this field, you're a composer and a producer. So you're wearing two hats, minimum. There's probably a few other hats
Orchestrator
as well. And yeah, all that stuff.
Sure.
Therapist. And it often surprises me at how many beginning composers, especially younger composers, especially composers who've gone to university, college, conservatory, come out with a pretty good understanding of how to write for orchestra and how to write in more traditional methods, but don't know how to use a reverb plugin or a compressor, or how to program a churning bass sound.
Or stick an electric guitar in there, or whatever it is, yeah.
So I really feel strongly that you need a well-rounded musical knowledge to be able to not only write the music, but also to be able to produce it. And honestly, there's so much you can learn just watching YouTube videos. Some of the best mixers and producers and engineers and orchestrators and composers have emptied their brains onto the internet, and just as we're doing right now, but to a lesser extent. And so there really is no excuse, because if you want to compete in this field, you are competing against literally everybody else who wants to do this and has been doing it for a while. You know, nobody's interested in hiring a beginning composer. They're looking for a trustworthy composer, you know, somebody who's going to deliver the goods on time, on budget. I mean, my job is to instill confidence. You know, it's 50% of how you get every job.
Professionalism, of course.
It's professionalism.
And that
exactly.
is something that, of course, needs to be stressed to any student or whatever, absolutely. You put your finger on something else which is really important, which is that you have to, A, have a very good musical vocabulary, a very diverse musical vocabulary, but also a very broad technical vocabulary, you know, to really understand. And as you say, I mean, the same way you might want a plaintive French horn, you might want a shredding electric guitar in the next bar, you know, and
Sure.
These are the kind of things that you need to be able to understand from the perspective of almost being genre agnostic.
To some extent, you know, there are boutique composers who really just do a very narrow set of things, but do it so well. They tend to come from the pop world or other, you know, avenues, you know, Ry Cooder or Max Richter.
Oh, sure, yeah.
You know, nobody hires Ry Cooder to do a synth score. Nobody hires Max Richter to do a synth score or you know, an overt synth
Of course.
score. So, but I agree that the more you're capable of as a musician, the more you are the right guy for the job, the right person for the job. And the more jobs that are appropriate for you to try out for. If you're interested in video games, get to understand the unique challenges of video game technology, which is just somewhat different from film and TV, but different enough that you need to steep yourself in it. And then get yourself out there, put yourself out there. You know, never release a piece of music that you're not proud of, both compositionally and creatively and technically. Something that shows who you are, what you're capable of, and sounds as good as anything you hear in film, TV, or games. So, you know, you can connect with filmmakers and TV people and YouTubers and video game devs online. You know, used to be people would go to film festivals, meet, you know, there. It's all gone online. Sure. It's not a great way to do it, but the other option is to kind of follow my path, which is that I worked for all these different composers and composers. Many working composers today started off as assistants or interns to working composers, including quite a few of my past assistants and interns. Several have gone on to really substantial careers.
Well, and that's always, you know, it's a great thing if you can get a gig like that and get a leg up. I think a lot of younger students, they really don't even know that such an art form exists. You know, I mean, that's...
I don't know.
I mean, there are some.
Really?
There are some. But, you know, it's interesting to me how many times I do, let's say, a panel at NAMM or South by or whatever we're doing, and people come up to us afterwards and say, you know, I didn't even know this was a gig.
Yeah.
I didn't even know you could do this, you know, and it's kind of fascinating to me because there's a lot of stuff on the surface that everybody sees and the glamorous jobs, you know. But one thing about composing is that, number one, you do it in sort of a vacuum, you know, in that you're not performing live and getting immediate feedback, right? It's like being a painter in a sense, you know. And then even when you are getting the feedback, as you said earlier, your goal is to almost be part of the scenery. And so you're working on something that at its ultimate best is not invisible, but not necessarily identifiable.
Yeah, you're
know,
not quite a rock star.
Right. I mean, who goes out and, yes, there are people who go out and buy soundtracks, no question about it. And there's a huge market for that. However, there are a whole lot of people who go, yeah, I saw this movie and it was really awesome. And they don't even think about, you know, the only way a soundtrack will register with them is if it's a song that they know, that some music supervisor decided to include in there, you know.
Sure.
But other than that, a lot of the incidental music that you create, I mean, just the word right there, incidental music, you know, almost speaks to an invisibleness.
Sure.
And so,
By the way, we don't use that word.
well, however, people do. And
We use diegetic.
diegetic?
Yeah, that's source music.
Ooh, okay.
Music that comes from something you see on screen.
Ah, okay. Ooh, I like that.
You know, if there's a musician on screen and somebody has to write what they're going to be playing, either before the fact or after the fact.
Interesting. But I think, you know, it's kind of fascinating the way you.
But they do call it underscore.
Ooh, okay, yes. But yeah, I mean, that's my point
That one
exactly.
is very appropriate.
Yes. And, you know, I mean, obviously, you do important stuff. And again, if it wasn't there, you know, the movie would probably suck, you know?
Well, you know, there's a reason that there have been almost no movies, commercial films without music. Been a couple, not a lot. I can think of 3 or 4 in the last 50 years.
I could think of maybe one.
Conspicuously didn't have music. Cloverfield.
Okay, I haven't seen that.
Only had an end title piece.
I haven't seen that. The one I was thinking of was My Dinner with Andre.
Yeah.
Yeah, but again, the whole movie is centered around a conversation in a restaurant, you know, so there's almost no need for it in that sense. But you're right, there's almost none because it's such a ubiquitous part of the whole package. So it's fascinating.
It is fascinating. But again, it just speaks to the power of music as a part of our lives.
Yeah. You've had a very interesting career, you know?
So far, I'm nowhere near done.
Well, I should hope not.
I'm just getting good at it.
A little more practice, right?
A lot more practice. You never stop. You never stop learning.
Of course not.
You know that.
I do. Jeff Rona, thank you for being my guest.
Daniel Keller, thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure.
Same.
Hey, I'm Daniel Keller. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join us each week for Insights in Sound.